the Brave Fisherman. Not so long ago, a young fisherman built a beautiful wooden house with a thatched roof by the river, close to a small village. His name was Ralph, though some called him Lucky Ralph. This was because he was incredibly skilled at catching fish. He had a small wooden boat and, over the years, had discovered his favorite fishing spots where he always managed to catch plenty of fish. He would keep one for himself and his wife, and the rest he would bring to the village market, where people were always happy to buy them. In time, he became the father of 2 children, a boy and a girl. He and his wife loved each other deeply, and they adored their children. As the kids grew, they brought their parents immense joy. From time to time, the fishermen would take them out fishing, and so their lives were filled with happiness and contentment. But as life often teaches us, nothing lasts forever. As the years went by, the fish in the stream became fewer and fewer. The fisherman aged, and his wooden boat aged with him. He began catching less and less fish and rarely visited the village, as he often had nothing to sell. There were days when he was thankful not to return home empty-handed, just managing to feed his family. When he did appear in the village, he sometimes carried only a single fish, and so people began calling him Poor Ralph. Sadly, they weren't far from the truth. With his old boat barely holding together, fishing became more difficult. He couldn't afford a new one, so he had no choice but to stay close to home while fishing. Ralph got used to it, and so did his wife and children. But things weren't the same anymore. One day, however, after a long stretch of bad luck, Ralph managed to catch more fish than usual. Excited, he rushed home and left one fish for his wife to make soup. Then, he headed to the village to sell the rest. When he arrived at the market, he noticed another fisherman with a stall full of fish, just like Ralph's had been in the old days. They struck up a conversation, and the other fisherman shared a piece of advice. He told Ralph that plenty of fish could be found near a large waterfall. The river there was wider, and few dared to venture that far, making it an ideal spot for fish to thrive. Ralph was thrilled by this news and thanked the fisherman warmly for the tip. As he made his way home, he couldn't stop thinking about the waterfall. Perhaps he could give it a try. After all, he had plenty of experience and could handle it without any trouble. But then he remembered that his boat was far from seaworthy, and so was he, truth be told. Still, the thought of a bigger catch tempted him greatly. In the end, he decided to sleep on it. He would make up his mind in the morning, depending on his mood and the weather. The next morning, he woke up unusually early. He couldn't sleep, his mind filled with visions of fish swarming beneath his boat in the clear waters near the waterfall. At the same time, he felt troubled. His wife wasn't happy at all about his plan for the day. Nervous yet excited, Ralph couldn't shake the idea. The thought of not even trying would haunt him for the rest of his life. After all, he was a fisherman, and he was used to catching plenty of fish. The weather was on his side. A warm, sunny day was just beginning. Ralph loaded his boat with his fishing rod, net, bait, and a large wooden bucket for the fish. Then he hopped in and set out on the water. His wife, in a last-minute burst of worry, ran out of the house, calling after him to be careful and reminding him how much she loved him. The fisherman paddled along the calm river and soon passed the spot where he usually docked his boat each day. He continued onward, and before long, he noticed that the river was gradually starting to widen. As he journeyed further, he realized he didn't need to paddle as often. The river was beginning to pick up speed on its own. Ralph knew he was getting closer to the waterfall, so he began steering his boat closer to the shore. Then the river curved slightly to the right, and around the bend, he could hear the soft rumbling of the waterfall in the distance. What came into view next was a narrow island covered with trees, splitting the river into 2 branches. The island stretched all the way to the edge of the rocky cliff, where the river tumbled down with a thunderous roar. At first, Ralph's heart tightened at the sight before him. But he was still far enough from the edge of the waterfall, and the current wasn't strong enough to stop him from safely maneuvering his boat, or turning back if needed. He steered his old boat toward the middle of the river, where the current was weakest. As soon as he spotted the first fish glimmering beneath the surface, a smile spread across his face. But suddenly, To his left, he heard a loud scream followed by a splash. Startled, he quickly turned and saw a young girl who had fallen from a steep bank into the water. She was struggling to stay afloat. Ralph didn't hesitate for even a second. He leaped from his boat into the river to help her. The girl cried out for help, and as soon as Ralph swam to her, she began to scream in fear. However, she soon realized the fisherman was only trying to help her, and she calmed down a bit. Together, they swam toward a shallow bank and climbed out of the water. Ralph then turned sharply toward the river, anxiously searching for his boat. To his dismay, he saw it drifting away, disappearing behind the island. Without wasting a moment, he jumped back into the water and swam as fast as he could toward the small island. Reaching the shore, he scrambled onto the land and sprinted toward the waterfall. Just as Ralph reached the waterfall, he saw his old boat tumble over the edge. It shattered into pieces as it hit the water and large rocks below. A wave of sadness washed over him. That boat had meant so much to him. Though it was old, it had been his lifeline, the key to catching fish and providing for his family. Tears stung his eyes as he stood there, staring at the remnants of his boat. But then a sudden realization struck him. Amid the chaos, he had left the girl alone on the bank without saying a word. Guilt weighed heavy on him as he hurried across the island to its opposite side. Without hesitation, he dove back into the water and swam toward the girl, who was still standing there, looking frightened and bewildered. Breathless, Ralph apologized to her, explaining that he had tried to save his boat but had sadly failed. Then he asked if she was all right and gently inquired about her name and what had happened to her. The girl introduced herself as Princess Vala and began to explain her ordeal. She had quarreled with her father, the king, and in a fit of anger had fled the castle. But her escape took a dangerous turn when she encountered a group of bandits who began chasing her through the forest. As she frantically tried to lose them, she found herself on a steep slope. Unable to stop herself, she slid down and fell straight into the river. Ralph apologized to the princess for not recognizing her immediately and gently explained that running away from home never truly solves any problems. He assured her that her father, the king, cared deeply for her and was likely very worried at that moment. Then, Ralph offered to escort her back to the castle. Vala thanked the fisherman for saving her and admitted that had she not run away and fallen into the river, Ralph's boat wouldn't have been lost. And so, both of them, soaking wet, began their slow journey through the forest toward the nearest road. Forest paths were not only safer, but also allowed sunlight to filter through the trees, helping them dry as they walked. It wasn't long before they reached a wide path, broad enough for 2 horse-drawn wagons to pass each other comfortably. The journey to the castle was quite long, so they passed the time by talking. Vala confided in Ralph about how strict and preoccupied her father had become in recent years. She told him that the king was so consumed by his duties that he hardly spent any time with her anymore. All she wanted was for her father to be her dad again, someone who would take her on little adventures, even just once in a while. Ralph, in turn, shared stories of his humble life with his family. Though they lived in poverty, they loved each other dearly and spent plenty of time together. He told her a few of his favorite fishing tales, and soon, Vala found herself growing very fond of the kind and courageous fisherman. Around midday, they finally caught sight of a grand castle with several towers standing atop a modest hill. As they approached the base of the hill, 2 knights on horseback appeared, clearly part of the search party looking for the princess. Vala explained to the knights that Ralph had rescued her when she was fleeing from bandits and that he was now accompanying her back to the castle. She also told them that she wanted Ralph to meet the king. At these words, Ralph hesitated. He had never set foot in a castle, let alone spoken to a king. He tried to explain to Vala that he should return home to his family, but the princess insisted he come with her. Before long, Ralph found himself standing in a grand hall. At the far end of the room was a large, gilded throne with plush red upholstery, upon which sat the king. He had a long gray beard and wore a gleaming crown. The king looked stern, but as soon as his eyes fell on Vala, his expression softened into a warm smile. The king rose from his throne and strode toward her with determined steps. Vala ran to meet him and wrapped her arms around him in a long embrace. The king then turned a skeptical gaze toward Ralph, whose worn linen shirt and trousers gave him a less than impressive appearance at first glance. Vala, however, quickly apologized to her father for running away and recounted everything that had happened: the bandits, Ralph's bravery in leaping into the water to save her, and the loss of his fishing boat in the process. She shared everything, even her feelings about her father being too busy to spend time with her as he once did. These words struck a chord in the king's heart, and he embraced his daughter tightly once more. Turning back to Ralph, the king approached him and placed a hand on his shoulder. Ralph lowered his head in humility, but the king urged him to look up. With heartfelt sincerity, the king thanked him for saving his daughter's life. Then, addressing Vala, the king suggested she change into fresh clothes because they were all going on an outing together, with Ralph included. Both Ralph and Vala exchanged surprised glances before looking back at the king, but Vala quickly broke into a smile and dashed off to her room with excitement. Meanwhile, the king struck up a brief conversation with Ralph, asking him about his modest home and his family. The king had a carriage prepared with horses and took a small pouch of gold coins from the royal treasury. When an excited and freshly dressed Vala returned, they set off on their journey. Throughout the ride, Vala kept asking where they were going, but the king remained tight-lipped, refusing to reveal his plans. It wasn't until Ralph recognized the familiar surroundings near the village market, where he had spent his life selling fish, that he began to plead with the king, insisting it wasn't necessary to take him all the way home. The king, however, assured him that they weren't headed to his home, but rather to the village, as he had a debt of gratitude to repay for Ralph's bravery. Upon arriving at the village, they headed straight to the market. The king stepped out of the carriage and purchased a large loaf of bread, smoked meat, plenty of vegetables and fruit, all of which were packed into a sturdy wooden crate. The crate was then loaded onto the carriage. Next, they visited the local boatwright. There, the king bought Ralph a brand new fishing boat complete with oars. In front of the gathered villagers, the king declared that this was a reward for Ralph's courage and selflessness. The wooden crate was loaded into the boat, and the king called upon 4 strong men who stood in awe of both the fisherman and the king to carry the boat to the river and gently set it afloat. The king and Vala accompanied Ralph to the riverbank. Once the men had launched the boat into the water, the king handed Ralph a pouch containing the remaining gold coins and wished him a safe journey home. Ralph couldn't stop thanking the king, overwhelmed by the unexpected fortune that had come his way. After bidding farewell to the king, Vala, and the men, Ralph set off in his new boat, a smile lighting up his face. The journey downriver was short, as his modest wooden home stood just a little way from the village. With his new boat laden with provisions and his heart full of gratitude, Ralph couldn't wait to share the day's incredible story with his family. As soon as Ralph reached his home and tied the boat to the shore, the old wooden door burst open. Out ran his worried wife, followed closely by their 2 children. They all rushed to him, embracing him tightly, not even noticing at first the brand new, beautiful wooden boat behind him. That evening, the humble fisherman's hut was filled with joy and laughter as the family celebrated with a feast. Over dinner, Ralph recounted the incredible events of the day, leaving his family in awe. The next morning, Ralph set out in his new boat, returning to the spot near the waterfall. By midday, he was back home with a bountiful catch of fish. Later, when the family went to the village market, Ralph didn't sell his fish, but offered them freely to the villagers. From that day forward, the people in the village began to call him Brave Ralph,